On the afternoon of May 26, 1828, a shoemaker in the city of Nuremberg noticed something that should not have existed. A young man stood alone in the Unschlittplatz, swaying on unsteady legs, dressed in a rough peasant coat that did not fit him. He clutched 2 letters in one hand. He could barely stand. When people approached him and asked who he was, he said nothing coherent, only a handful of broken phrases, repeated like a prayer he did not understand. "I want to be a rider, like my father was." That was almost all he could say. He did not know his age. He did not know the year. He did not know the name of the city he was standing in, or the country, or what a horse-drawn carriage was, even as one nearly ran him down. When the shoemaker and a passing cobbler tried to walk him toward the nearest guardhouse, he moved like someone who had never truly learned to walk on open ground, stiff-legged, uncertain, flinching at every new sound. Now imagine standing in that square yourself. Imagine looking into the eyes of a young man who appeared to be 16 or 17 years old, and realizing that he was, in every meaningful sense, encountering the entire world for the very first time. This was Kaspar Hauser, and for the next 5 years, his existence would obsess an entire kingdom, ignite one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 19th century, and end, like it began, in blood and unanswered questions. The guards at the Nuremberg watchhouse did not know what to make of him. He was brought in and questioned, but he could not answer. He could write his name, Kaspar Hauser, in clumsy letters, but almost nothing else. He recoiled from candlelight as though it burned him. He refused ordinary food, eating only bread and water, and vomited when given meat or beer. He seemed to have no concept of pain in any conventional sense, yet the slightest new stimulus overwhelmed him completely. The 2 letters he carried only deepened the confusion. The first, addressed to a cavalry captain, claimed to be from a poor laborer who had raised the boy since infancy, but could no longer care for him. It said the child had been left at the laborer's door in 1812 with a note asking that he be raised as a Christian, and that he had never once been allowed to take a single step outside the house in which he was kept. The second letter, written in a different hand, but styled to appear as though it came from the boy's long-dead mother, gave a birth date, April 30th, 1812, and claimed his father had been a cavalry officer in the 6th Regiment. Neither letter made sense on close inspection. The details contradicted each other. The handwriting seemed disguised. And most disturbing of all, if the story were true, it meant this boy, who could not climb stairs, could not tolerate sunlight, and spoke like a small child, had spent almost his entire life, from infancy to adolescence, locked away in total isolation. Word spread through Nuremberg within days. By the time it reached the local newspapers, it had spread through Bavaria. Within weeks, all of Europe was talking about the child of Europe, a phrase soon coined by the philosopher Anselm von Feuerbach, one of the most respected legal minds of the age, who became fascinated, and eventually consumed, by Kaspar's case. Because here is the question that nobody could answer. Who leaves a living human being to rot in a locked room for 16 years, and why release him now? Professor Georg Friedrich Daumer took Kaspar into his home shortly after the discovery, determined to educate him and, more importantly, to understand him. What Daumer documented in the following months reads less like a case study and more like watching a human mind assemble itself from scratch in real time. Kaspar had never seen the stars before. When shown the night sky, he was reportedly moved to tears, insisting someone must have arranged the lights so beautifully on purpose. He did not understand the concept of distance. The moon to him seemed close enough to touch. He could not initially distinguish men from women, or understand that a painted picture of a person was not itself alive. His senses, meanwhile, were reportedly extraordinary in ways that unsettled even trained observers. He could allegedly see in near total darkness. He could smell the difference between metals. Loud sounds, bright colors, and strong smells caused him physical distress that bordered on convulsive. Was this the profile of a boy raised from infancy in total sensory deprivation? Many believed so. Feuerbach certainly did. He would later write an entire treatise arguing that Kaspar's condition was consistent with nothing else. But others, quietly at first, and then more loudly, began to whisper a very different theory. What if none of it was true? What if the sensitivity to light, the halting speech, the childlike wonder, all of it was performance? Nuremberg had, after all, just witnessed a spectacle that made Kaspar Hauser the most famous person in the German-speaking world. Fame, money, sympathy, a home, a tutor, an audience of aristocrats and scholars competing for his attention. For a clever young man with something to hide, that was not a bad outcome at all. The city was split in two, and soon the argument would move from parlors and newspapers into something far more dangerous. On October 17, 1829, just 5 months after Kaspar's appearance in the square, Daumer went down to his cellar and found Kaspar bleeding from a wound on his forehead. Kaspar's account was chilling. He said a hooded man wearing a black cloth over his face had cornered him in the cellar and struck him, hissing a threat before fleeing. "You still have to die before you leave the city of Nuremberg." The wound was real. The blood was real. And suddenly, the entire narrative shifted. If someone had gone to such lengths to hide Kaspar Hauser for 16 years, and he had somehow escaped that captivity, then whoever was responsible might now be trying to silence him permanently. The city council, alarmed, assigned him police protection. Public sympathy, which had already been considerable, surged even further. Kaspar was moved between the homes of increasingly prominent guardians, a schoolteacher, an English nobleman named Lord Stanhope, who took a deep and lasting interest in the boy's welfare, and eventually to the town of Ansbach, where he was placed under the direct supervision of a schoolmaster named Johann Georg Meyer, with Feuerbach himself keeping close watch as a kind of unofficial guardian. But the skeptics noticed something too convenient about the timing. The attack came at the exact moment public interest in Kaspar's story was beginning, ever so slightly to fade, and the wound, though real, was shallow, a graze, not a killing blow. Some began to suggest, cautiously, that Kaspar might have staged the attack himself, desperate to remain the center of a world that had finally, for the first time in his life, paid attention to him. Picture that possibility for a moment. A boy raised in darkness, suddenly given warmth, education, food, admiration, and then watching in real time as the world's fascination began to cool. What would a person do to keep from being forgotten again? Nobody could prove either version. And Kasper Hauser, walking the streets of Ansbach under armed protection, carried on with his lessons, his letters, and his slowly improving grasp of language, never once giving a straight, verifiable account of who had raised him, where, or why. As the years passed, a theory took shape that would outlast every other explanation, not because it was proven, but because it was the only one that seemed to explain both the mystery and the motive for silencing it. The rumor was this: Kasper Hauser was not a nobody. He was, some whispered, the rightful hereditary Prince of Baden, a legitimate heir to the throne of the Grand Duchy of Baden, secretly swapped at birth as an infant with a dying peasant child, then hidden away for 16 years so that a rival branch of the ruling family could seize the succession uncontested. The theory had just enough real scandal underneath it to feel plausible. The ruling House of Baden had, in fact, been consumed by exactly this kind of succession crisis in the years around Kasper's supposed birth. A legitimate infant heir had, according to official records, died in infancy in 1812, under circumstances that some contemporaries found suspicious. Power then passed to a different branch of the family, one that had every political incentive to make sure no surviving claimant to that throne ever surfaced. If the theory were true, then the letters found on Kasper in the square were not the ramblings of some anonymous peasant guardian. They were a coded confession, or a cruel joke, or possibly even a genuine attempt by someone involved in the conspiracy to finally set their conscience and their prisoner free. Feuerbach believed it, or at least he believed it enough to begin making dangerous inquiries. He wrote urgently to powerful contacts. He hinted, in private correspondence, that he was closing in on the truth, and that the truth involved people whose names could bring down the reputations of ruling houses. In May of 1833, Anselm von Feuerbach died suddenly. Officially, the cause was illness. Unofficially, rumors of poisoning began circulating almost immediately, rumors that have never been fully extinguished to this day. The one man treating Kasper's case with the full rigor of legal and scientific method, the one man who might have assembled the pieces into an undeniable conclusion, was gone, and Kaspar Hauser was still alive, still living quietly in Ansbach, still unable to answer the one question everyone wanted answered. Who am I, really? He had less than 6 months left to live. On December 14, 1833, Kaspar Hauser came home with a deep stab wound in his chest. His account, given while he was still conscious and lucid, was specific. He said a stranger had lured him to the Ansbach court garden with the promise of a purse, a bag supposedly left there for him by an unknown benefactor. When he arrived, the man stabbed him once, deeply, in the left side of his chest, and fled. A small violet purse was indeed found nearby, containing a cryptic note written in mirror image handwriting, backward, so that it could only be read using a mirror. Roughly translated, it taunted the authorities, claiming the writer would reveal his identity and hometown, before descending into a strange, disjointed set of clues that led nowhere at all. Kaspar lingered for 3 days. He was in agony, but he remained coherent enough to describe his attacker, and to insist, again and again, that the story was true, that someone had finally come to finish what had been started in that cellar 4 years earlier. On December 17, 1833, Kaspar Hauser died. His last words, recorded by those at his bedside, were reportedly, "I did not do it myself." A denial made with his final breath, as though he already knew that the world's suspicion would outlive him. And the world's suspicion did exactly that. Because almost immediately, doctors and investigators noticed something deeply strange about the wound. The physicians who examined Kasper's injury noted that it was unusually shallow for a fatal stab wound, and unusually precisely placed, striking a location that, while dangerous, was not the kind of blind, desperate thrust one would expect from a violent stranger in a dark garden. More troubling still, no one else ever saw the attacker. No footprints beyond Kasper's own were conclusively identified in the snow-dusted garden. The purse, so conveniently discovered, contained a note that many investigators immediately suspected of being written by Kasper himself, his handwriting, by that point, having developed enough sophistication to disguise itself, and mirror writing being a plausible trick for someone attempting to fake a stranger's message. Had Kaspar Hauser staged his own death, perhaps intending only to reignite public sympathy and royal attention, exactly as some believed he had done 4 years earlier in Daumer's cellar, only for the wound to go fatally, tragically wrong this time? Or had a real assassin, skilled enough to strike with surgical precision and vanish without a trace, finally succeeded where the cellar attack had failed, silencing forever the one person who might have exposed a stolen royal bloodline? 2 centuries later, that question has never been answered with certainty, and it may never be. For over 150 years, the mystery sat frozen exactly where it ended in 1833, until modern science offered a tantalizing possibility. In the 1990s, and again in the 2000s, researchers obtained samples believed to be Kaspar Hauser's hair and blood, preserved on old clothing and medical materials, and compared his mitochondrial DNA to living descendants of the House of Baden. The first tests, conducted in 1996, appeared to rule out the royal swap theory entirely. The DNA sequence did not match the maternal line of the Baden family. It seemed, at last, like science had closed the book. But then came a second complication. In 2002, further testing on different preserved samples produced a partial match to the Baden line after all, reopening the very door the first study had seemingly sealed shut. Contamination, sample degradation, and the sheer difficulty of authenticating 170-year-old biological material meant that neither result could be treated as fully conclusive. So even genetics, the supposed final word in modern true crime mysteries, left the Kasper Hauser case exactly where it started. Unresolved, contested, and endlessly debated by historians, forensic scientists, and amateur investigators who still travel to Ansbach today to see the modest monument marking the place where he died. Think, for a moment, about what actually happened to this young man over the course of his brief and strange life. If his account was true, he spent 16 years in near total isolation. No human contact, no language, no sunlight, no understanding of a world that existed just beyond a wall he could not open. And then, without warning, he was placed into the middle of a city, surrounded by strangers, expected to somehow become a person overnight. Whether or not every detail of his story was accurate, the horror of that possibility, a human being deliberately erased from the world for the crime of simply being born, is enough to explain why his case gripped an entire continent. Kasper Hauser was not just a curiosity. He was a mirror held up to questions people still find impossible to look away from. What does it mean to be human when no one has ever taught you how? And what does a ruling class do to protect its power if it thinks no one is watching? He never conclusively answered who he was. Perhaps he never truly knew himself. He may have been a runaway with a gift for performance and a desperate need to be seen. He may have been a genuine victim of the most calculated act of cruelty imaginable. Or he may have been exactly what the rumors claimed, the rightful heir to a throne, erased from history by people whose names we will likely never know. What is certain is this. On a spring afternoon in 1828, a stranger appeared in a German city square, unable to speak, unable to explain himself, carrying 2 letters that made no sense. And by the time winter came again 5 years later, he was dead, carrying his true story with him into a grave that historians, geneticists, and mystery hunters have been trying to reopen ever since. The inscription on his monument in Ansbach reads, in Latin, "Here lies Kasper Hauser, riddle of his time. His birth was unknown, his death mysterious." Nearly 2 centuries later, that epitaph has never needed to be rewritten. The riddle remains exactly as it was left, open, unresolved, and waiting.